Immagini, chi bene intender cupe, quel ch'io or vidi, e ritegna l'image, mentre ch'io dico come ferma rupe.
Fatti non foste a viver come bruti, ma per seguir virtute e conoscenza.
Indi all'eterno lume s'addrizzaro, nel qual non si dee creder che s'invii per creatura l'occhio tanto chiaro.
We just heard a recitation of the Divine Comedy by three very, very different actors. I wanted to show you how the Divine Comedy can sound when recited by professional actors and how different it can really come out from the voice of very different styles and differently trained actors. The first one was Lucilla Giagnoni, the second one was Vittorio Gassman, and the third one was Roberto Benigni. So maybe we have covered the entire palette of possibilities of how you can recite the Divine Comedy really in Italian. So we are at Canto 13 of Paradiso. Canto 13 is another one where Dante is infusing a lot of theory, a lot of philosophy and theology. And it's interesting because one of the Italian scholars that I've been reading and studying, Anna Maria Chiavacci, this is her book that I've been using, the Divina Commedia, and this is also a text used in universities and schools. She finds this particular canto not as intensely poetic as other cantos. I don't know if I entirely agree with her here, but she thinks that in fact the canto still retains the poetic intensity only thanks to the middle core part in the center where Dante talks about creation. Aside from that, it's not as poetic because it's almost sandwiched in between a very poetical description of the saints and what is gonna come in the next cantos, which is visually magnificent. And I personally don't really agree with this because I find it very musical, very intriguing, but yes, it is fully theological. And so Anna Maria Chiavacci says only another canto now going forward will repeat the same type of risky or dangerous structure that Dante is using here, and that's Canto 29 of Paradiso. So far, we had Canto 4, Canto 7, and this Canto 13, where Dante has used almost only theology and theory rather than a good balance between narration and theology. Dante is simply following this thread that started in Canto 10, where St. Thomas Aquinas made his long monologue, and there were two moments that created some doubts in Dante's mind, or two questions in Dante's mind. The first question has already been answered, and it was the question about the Dominicans. There seemed to be a little bit of reprimanding by St. Thomas of the Dominicans, and that's been properly explained. Another verse of this monologue in Canto 10 by St. Thomas seemed to talk about Solomon as the most splendid of these 12 souls that were rotating around Dante. And we are still firmly in the sun, in the circle of the sun, but inside the sun. And about Solomon, Thomas said what the Bible says, quoted the Bible saying that nobody has reason wiser than Solomon. And this kind of irked Dante, who wants to understand how is it possible when he's thinking about Adam, who was created directly by God, and also he's thinking about Jesus Christ. How could Solomon be superior to these two men? In this canto, in Canto 13, St. Thomas explains to Dante the reason why that's not the case, using a good theological explanation and argument. However, at the same time, we can see that Dante used this question and answer structure almost as an excuse to insert a beautiful, stunning, magnificent part or portion that talks about the creation, all of creation. Another Dante scholar, Teodolinda Barolini, she has a more positive opinion of this canto, and she says that the technical pretext allows Dante to turn to the magnificent spectacle of the one becoming many, while somehow still remaining eternally one, a process caught by the poet in great poetry, and I would agree with this assessment. So, in other words, we can say that Canto 13 is about creation and at the same time is about wisdom, because Dante wants to understand his question about Solomon is a question really about the Bible. And this is the beauty of Dante's way to, let's say, mirror what was happening in the theological circles around him in his world at that time. The scholastic philosophy, the scholastic theology was all made of this rhythm of question. It was really built upon a dialogue, question, answer, and a constant perfecting of the arguments, just like St. Thomas Aquinas did in his writings. So, in order to explain why Solomon is in fact has in fact been chosen by God to be the wisest of kings, but he's not wiser than Jesus or Adam, St. Thomas gives us a whole panoramic exposition that talks about the real fundamental reality, which is a really important point here, because we are in Paradiso, everything seems so ethereal, abstract, but it's not less real than what we heard in Inferno and Purgatorio. Let's remember very well that the Divine Comedy is the opposite of escapist fiction. And Paradiso even more, because Paradiso is all about the most fundamental reality, even if it doesn't look like it at first sight. Having answered Dante's question and having explained these theological points to Dante, St. Thomas then moves on towards the final part of the canto, towards kind of an admonition that Dante is sending to us, the readers, he's sending to the people of his time and also to us, the readers, about the proper way to discern about things, the proper way to think about things, and this is very much linked to the topic of the wisdom and the wise king. This is why, as always, he is very interested in the qualities of a great leader, of a great king or great emperor. But that's how the canto then ends. And let's see here, I recently read for the first time a classic that's called Night from Elie Wiesel. And something that hit me, a sentence that I highlighted in this book because I found it powerful, and I link it to Dante, but also the scholastic philosophy and St. Thomas, is this one. Man comes closer to God through the question he asks him, he liked to say. Therein lies true dialogue. Man asks and God replies. But we don't always understand his replies. This spiritual dialogue that a human being can have with the divine, back and forth, which is all obviously at different levels, is reflected in this constant and unrelenting rhythm by Dante. He keeps asking questions about things that he writes, things that he puts in characters' mouths, and it's through this dialogue of question and answer that he lets real truths bloom in the Divine Comedy. So Canto 13 starts still in the fourth heaven, the heaven of the sun. So we are in the sun, and it really hits us immediately how, I'm reading the Italian portion, but I think most translators use the word imagine to translate immagini. Dante keeps using this verb, immagini, image, immagini, imagine, at least 4 or 5 times in the first tercets. And there is a good reason for this. It sounds almost like Imagine by John Lennon, but these lyrics are not nearly as misguided as John Lennon's lyrics of Imagine. In this case, Dante is using immagini because he wants to try and teach us a way of using our mind our imagination as one of the most powerful skills and tools that we have in our mind in order to look into things that are not easy to understand and penetrate their mystery and really understand them. This is almost like an imaginative exercise, and it could be read almost as an exercise that a mystic would do with his own spiritual abilities. And this is why, in this particular case, given that Dante is going to present us very profound truths, he is trying to stimulate that particular skill that we have. And in fact, as an imaginative exercise, this beginning of canto is not easy at all, because we're supposed to count stars and to know a lot of good astronomy that Dante is including here. What is Dante telling us to imagine? We should imagine the 15 stars that are the brightest ones in the sky. Let's try to imagine this incredibly bright, medieval, non-polluted by light sky. The 15 brightest ones. And then let's try to imagine he says, quel carro a cui il seno basta del nostro cielo, that chariot that is always visible in our northern hemisphere, which is the Ursa Major, because we know that it doesn't ever go below the horizon. We can always see it, and this is correct and good astronomy. Imagine that, and then also imagine imagine the Ursa Minor, and in particular the two brightest stars that are part of the Ursa Minor, that are the end of its little tail. And of course, the last one, the last star of the Ursa Minor, is the so-called pole star or North Star. And that's why Dante calls it lo stelo, in punta dello stelo. So at this point, how many stars has Dante asked us to imagine? There are 15, plus the stars that compose the Ursa Major, which is 7, plus 2. So the total is 24. He's asking us to imagine 24 very, very bright stars. And they are disposed in two circles that are rotating, one in the opposite direction of the other. And he's referring us to Minoi, la figliola di Minoi, or Minos' daughter, who was Ariadne, and who we know from the myths that when she died, the god Bacchus took her crown of flowers, and in the myth, she transformed this crown of flowers into a constellation. In fact, he transformed that into the Corona Borealis. Dante changes this myth around a little bit, and in his fiction, he makes Ariadne herself being transformed into the Corona Borealis, this crown of stars by Bacchus. This very long sentence finds its kind of point at verse 19, where Dante says, e avrà quasi l'ombra della vera costellazione e della doppia danza. What Dante is saying here is, finally, after we have imagined and tried to imagine all of these things, we will almost have a vague recognition or a vague image of what was happening around him and Beatrice, who are in the middle of these two concentric circles that are rotating in different directions. And then he uses a beautiful simile. He says the truth of this is so distant from our senses, exceeds our senses so much, or as much as the difference between the movement of the waters of the Chiana River, which was a really sluggish, slow river, and the speed of the Primum Mobile, which is the fastest of the heavens that rotates around the earth. Now, verse 25. Lì si cantò non Bacco, non Peana, ma 3 persone in divina natura. E in una persona essa è l'umana. Very intense tercet, because he's saying that the souls in these two circles are singing. They're dancing and singing, but they're not singing of pagan gods like Bacchus, like Peana, and there is a little bit of a reference to Virgil here. But they're singing about the Trinity, and they're singing about the incarnation of the Word, which are the two big mysteries that Dante has been talking about. In this canto, he will focus a lot on the Trinity, and he will go back to the Trinity with his use of words and use of poetry. The second part of this canto starts with verse 31, and that's when all the souls in these two circles have stopped simultaneously in a very harmonic way, and one of these lights starts speaking, actually breaks the silence. Let's compare the poetry of Dante to Mandelbaum's here. It's almost, I would say, not possible for Mandelbaum to really imitate it, but Dante gives us a sound with his poetry that imitates the breaking the silence, because everything falls silent, the circles stop rotating, and then we need to pause for a second in the reading, and then we have verse 31 that says, ruppe il silenzio, and ruppe is the verb, it means break the silence, while Mandelbaum's translation is, the silence of the blessed fellowship was broken by the very light, which is a bit more straightforward, but less maybe onomatopoeic. So this is St. Thomas Aquinas again, who introduces himself again. He's just been speaking a lot, but in this particular case, he will be doing what he does best, which is his scholastic philosophy. And so in one sense, we could say that this is one of the cantos where St. Thomas Aquinas' theology shines the most, because the type of structure that Thomas gives to his speech and to his monologue is resembles very closely a scholastic disquisition. Tu credi che nel petto onde la costa si trasse per formar la bella guancia, il cui palato a tutto il mondo costa, e in quel che forato dalla lancia e prima e poscia tanto soddisfece. These are beautiful and poetic expressions to talk about Adam and Christ without saying their names. Adam is the one, in fact, the way that Dante is alluding to Adam is by talking about his rib that became Eve. And then he talks about a rib in the case of Christ as well, just a couple of verses after. And is there a reason why he's doing this aside from poetic reasons? The poetic reason is immediately understandable. He wants everything to be very harmonic and interconnected and beautiful. But there might be also a tentative from Dante to imply that just like the moment when Eve was created from Adam's rib, then the moment when Christ was struck with the spear in his ribs, in his rib cage, was a very creative moment. So it was a creative moment, meaning that from that wound, all of Christianity came out, and it was an image or a scene that almost summarized his passion. This is why then Dante also talks about the bilancia. Bilancia is the scale in modern Italian, and even for Dante is a word that means the balance, the equilibrium that is between in one plate we have all the sins of humanity, and in the other plate we have the passion of Christ, and the passion of Christ outweighs the sins of humanity. He says, quantunque alla natura umana fece di aver lume, which means the highest of the light, meaning the wisdom that God gave to humanity, went to Adam and to Christ, to these two men. E però miri a ciò che io dissi suso, but you are doubtful because you are comparing with what I said in Canto 10, when I said at verse 112 in Canto 10, entro vel altamente usi profondo, saver fu messo, che, se il vero è vero, a veder tanto non surse il secondo, which means no other ever rose with so much vision. St. Thomas Aquinas here in Canto 10 was doing nothing else than quoting the Bible, the Book of Kings. In fact, the entire Canto 13 revolves around these lines in the Book of Kings in the Bible. And it's a dialogue between God and Solomon in one of Solomon's dreams. God appears in a dream to Solomon, and basically he asks him, ask me whatever I shall give thee, anything that you want. And Solomon said, give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and bad, for who is able to judge this, thy so great a people? And the speech pleased the Lord, that Solomon has asked this thing. And God said to him, because you have asked this thing, and you have not asked for thyself a long life, or neither riches, or you have not asked for the life of your enemies, or anything else. Behold, I have done according to your words. I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there was none like thee before thee, neither after thee shall any arise like unto thee. Let's remember that in university circles, in scholastic circles, in Dante's times, there were a lot of debates around this particular scripture passages. There were even schools of thought. Somebody was taking part with one school of thought, somebody was taking part with another, and very often in the Divine Comedy, but specifically in Paradiso, Dante uses his cantos to tell us which schools of thought in this sometimes even petty debates he wanted to side with, because he preferred one interpretation instead of the other. And in this case, it's a little bit maybe simpler, because he is talking about Jesus and Adam being the most wise men created by God, and that was not really something of a dispute. But what was a dispute in Dante's times was the fate of Solomon. Had Solomon been saved or damned after his death? And this was a big hotly debate theological question in his times. So clearly Dante sides with the people. I believe Saint Jerome was saying that Solomon had been saved, and against the interpretation of Saint Augustine, who said that in his opinion Solomon had not been saved. This was how they spent time back then. Paradiso is also the canto of the circle as the most perfect geometric shape, and we've already noticed it so far, but going forward you're going to notice more and more how Dante insists on this circular geometry in many metaphors and similes that he uses as well. Like, for example, in verse 49, ora apri gli occhi a quel che io ti rispondo, e vedrai il tuo credere e il mio dire, your belief and my saying, nel vero farsi come centro in tondo. I like this image. They will come together in truth, just like the center in a circle. This is where the most magnificent part of the canto starts, where Thomas embarks in a poetic rendition of God's creation, all of God's creation. This is something to read very, very slowly to really understand the nuances, and we don't have time in this little video, but that's my suggestion to you. Ciò che non muore e ciò che può morire, whatever is mortal and whatever is not mortal, non è se non splendor di quella idea, this divine idea. Divine idea is God's mind, and God's mind has the light that is reflected in all of creation that is contingent and all creation that is not contingent, like angels and heavens and skies. Che partorisce amando il nostro sire. Immediately here St. Thomas is linking the concept of creation to the concept of love, and love is at the center of the idea of Trinity. He will repeat the principle of Trinity in this disquisition very, very often. This tercet that starts with verse 55 really describes the Trinity in such a perfect way. Maybe is the best tercet that describes the Trinity just using the power of words. There are in fact two words that are of Dante's coinage. He created these words. One is disuna, which means not being one anymore, and the other one is intrea, which means becoming three. Just like he used another word some cantos ago, in dua, which means literally into or becoming two. So, che quella viva luce che si mea, that pours out, this light pours out from the source, that's the Father, God, che non si disuna da lui né dall'amor che a lor si intrea. Let's see what Mandelbaum tells us in English. the living light that pours out so from its bright source that it does not disjoin from it or from the love entwined with them. Per sua bontate il suo raggiare aduna. In 9 sussistenze, these 9 subsistences are the 9 hierarchies of the different angels, one for each heaven, the 9 angels. Eternalmente, being eternally remaining just one. Then this light descends, heaven after heaven after heaven, and these ultime potenze is the raw materials that creation is made of. In fact, we have the creation at verse 66, con seme e senza seme, which means with a seed and without a seed. So with seed is animals and vegetables, and without is any kind of mineral that's part of creation. So this light that filters through the heavens gradually is decreasing its power until it gets to earth and creates these animals, vegetables, and minerals, each different and each reflecting a different degree of this light. The real point of Dante's physics, if we want to call it that, is the Tercet at verse 67. He says, La cera, the wax, he loved wax in all of his metaphors and similes, but here he means the raw material. The raw material di costoro e di chi la duce non sta d'un modo. This is not something that is immutable, it keeps changing, is always different. E però sotto il segno ideale, poi più e men traluce. In other words, traluce means it lets transpire, it lets the light through in ways that are more or less, depending on the object that is being created. So all the creatures are not perfect, but some of them are reflecting the divine light more than others. This is the differentiation in creation. Then Thomas repeats the concept and he says, if all of the light that comes from God was absorbed by a creature, then that creature would have all the divine light in itself. However, nature, and this is verse 76, nature la dà sempre scema, always works defectly. She passes on the light much like an artist who knows his craft but has a hand that trembles. I think this is one of the greatest verses of Dante, and I almost think this is one of the central verses for him in this canto, because wasn't he, after all, exactly this artist that he's singing about, that he's writing about, this artist with a trembling hand? His mission of being the scribe of God, of writing the Divine Comedy, must have felt so heavy sometimes that his hand in writing must have been trembling. So I'm sure that in a way, at a certain level, he's talking about himself here in this verse. Dell'arte a man che trema, the trembling hand. Però se il caldo amor, and we are here back to the Trinity, verse 79, caldo amor is the warm love, is the Holy Spirit. La chiara vista, the sight, is the sun. Della prima virtù, the first virtue, is the Father. Dispose e segna tutta la perfezione quivi s'acquista. All the perfection in this case, in this creature, is possible, and that happened only in 2 cases, in the case of Adam and in the case of Christ. This is why I approve your opinion, St. Thomas says to Dante, that human nature was never just like it's been in those 2 people. Now, at this point, if I stop my dissertation here, you would still have your question, which is, so how is it possible that Solomon was without any people below him? And St. Thomas reminds Dante of the actual words that he used, which were in particular one word, which was surse. And this is at verse 106. Se al surse drizzi gli occhi chiari. Surse means he rose. Solomon rose. Based on this rose, Dante is supposed by St. Thomas to have understood already, or to be able to understand, that St. Thomas was speaking about kings. He was speaking about only people who are elevated to the rank of kings or emperors. And only comparatively to all these people, Solomon is the utmost, and nobody will ever be superior to him. But because of this, he's not superior to Adam and Jesus. This is the conclusion. It's also beautiful how between verse 91 and 106, what Thomas is doing is really articulating on the passages from the Bible, from the Book of Kings, because it refers to the question that God asked Solomon, and the things that Solomon did not ask, even if he could have asked. However, these things are not exactly what is contained in the Bible, but these are questions that Solomon did not ask and come from Dante's imagination. We could say Dante's imagination, but technically these are really scholastic questions. These are theology questions that Dante must have heard in theology classes, in theology universities, and more or less they are drawn from 4 different fields. Speculative theology, how many are the angels? From dialectic, will a mixture of a necessary and contingent premise ever yield a necessary conclusion? From natural science, must we grant that motion had a beginning? And fourth, geometry. Can a triangle be constructed in a semicircle in such a way that it doesn't contain a right angle? And all the 4 answers to these questions are negative. In Dante's view, Solomon's wisdom, practical wisdom, trumps this all this formal intelligence. The final part of the canto starts with verse 112. There is a clear separation, because here this part begins within St. Thomas' monologue, which is an admonition to people, contemporary people, and also to the readers. Come un lasso e al sì e al no che tu non vedi. The whole final part has to do with discernment, to the art of using our intelligence and imagination, as we've been already taught by the rest of the canto, in being very careful when we are in doubt. The sì e no che tu non vedi, which means when you are in front of something very either mysterious or contradictory, like the apparent contradiction between what the Bible said and the words of St. Thomas in this example. This final portion is really very much about appearances and how our minds are very easily distracted and misled by appearances. I think what is the appearances of things. That's why he makes different examples. The ship that seems so strong, but then it crashes and fails just before getting into the harbor. And then the very last tercet is particularly important for Dante, because it talks again about one drop, vederli dentro al consiglio divino. The point being, who can really see God's will and God's thinking? Nobody can. Therefore, whenever you see somebody who is robbing or stealing, or somebody who is donating and gifting, we as human beings, be careful before making any type of judgment, because the one who's robbing might be saved and on his way to heaven, and the one who is actually gifting and being outwardly very generous is destined to go to hell. And this refers to many previous examples that we've seen in the Divine Comedy. I think I'm hoping that this is sufficient to get an idea of how theological and theoretical Canto 13 is. I actually agree with the scholars that particularly like this one, but let me know what you guys think, and if any part of this canto hit your imagination more than others, for the positive or for the negative, please let me know. Thank you again. Thanks for watching.